Okay.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Caffeine Stream Revived. My name is CB Robertson, and today I'm joined by a very special guest to talk about Homer from maybe a little different angle than we usually talk about in the classics. Um, Adam, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah. Well, first off, thanks for having me, Chris. My name's Adam Majors. I'm an Iraq war veteran and a psychotherapist. I often tell people that I kind of stumbled into this role by accident. So in the course of my own recovery process, I started reading everything I got my hands on and just fell in love with psychology. And one thing led to another. And ultimately, I fell in love with the Odyssey and a lot of other ancient stories about returning warriors and noticing a lot of the common themes and noticing how that showed up in my own dreams, that a lot of that imagery showed up in my own dreams during my own recovery. And then I saw it in the lives of my patients. And I wrote a book about it called Odysseus and the Oar, Healing After War and Military Service. So, for me, this is a huge passion and I'm excited to share it with other people.
I have to skip my usual Homer joke, which is asking people if they're an Iliad person or an Odyssey person. Um, it's funny usually to ask it because people immediately simultaneously grasp that one, there's no reason they should be either one or the other, and
Sure.
two, everyone realizes that they are either one or the other.
Yeah. I
Um,
really, I really, honestly, I love both. And
mm,
it's really hard to choose. This one is just the one that felt most relevant in terms of my work, but yeah, I mean, I have a love the Iliad as well.
well, I have to ask, did you follow my path, which is in your late teens or perhaps 20s, find yourself much more of an Iliad person, and then as you got older, became more of an Odyssey person, or is that just me?
Honestly, my only exposure to the Odyssey would have been uh me having some high school coursework that I failed to do. We were supposed to do the Odyssey and I didn't. I used, Spark Notes to do some assignments, and then there was plenty of assignments I did not do. So I didn't read it like I was supposed to. And I didn't know anything about the Iliad. So um, you know, a lot of my exposure would have been like um, I think basically like secondhand mention, like didn't actually read any of the lines from either poem. So, and then there, of course, there's things like, "Oh brother, where art thou?" Where
Right.
you get some familiarity that there are references elsewhere.
I,
But I
I
really,
I didn't I didn't know this was my first exposure, but my first exposure was back in early high school. I read Watership Down
oh wow,
um about the rabbits. It was like a very unnecessarily brutal story for a kid story about rabbits, and then later on you discover why, and you're like, oh, okay.
you were much more curious and open when you were younger than I was, evidently, because I read like three books my whole life until I got to college. So I pretty much cheated my way all through middle school and high school. I avoided reading like the plague. So
Well, I mean, as someone who I'm assuming you went to public schools as well, I don't blame you. It's just the friend group I was in happened to be into that, and I wound up enjoying it too. But I mean, here we are, and as you say, you were exposed to these things too. And what's fascinating about Homer is that, um the first written text we have of Homer comes from, if I remember correctly, 1488. Um, you certain number of people are chuckling to themselves. Um, like, but even in the ninth and 10th century and earlier than that, the stories of Hector and of Achilles and of Odysseus were known by the European public. So this kind of this water, this Homeric ocean that people were swimming in the stories was known even before the first text. And I feel like that's how many of us became familiar. We vaguely recall, oh yes, wasn't there a Wishbone,
Right.
show where the dog was Odysseus, threading the axes. We all know about Charybdis and Scylla. We all, even if we don't know the names, um, we know about the Trojan horse. We,
Yep.
these vague recollections of these themes that are persistent in our culture, as they appear to have been even before they were um, written down, or at least available to the public, be in written form. And that seems to have not changed in the last 1500 years or so.
Yeah, I honestly, so when I wrote this book, or when I decided to write this book, it would probably surprise most people, maybe not, but I think it would surprise most people to know that I knew almost nothing about Homer, the Iliad, or the Odyssey. I had read Jonathan Shea's book, um, Achilles in Vietnam, which I think is a great book. And I had read Odysseus in America, which I think is a terrible book. And I think it does a tremendous disservice to veterans. And it makes my blood boil knowing he got like the $500,000 MacArthur grant for that, the Genius Grant, as they call it. Because to me, that his interpretation of the Odyssey is just loaded with negative projections about veterans that I think are harmful to veterans.
uh,
I think also it really distorts the Odyssey itself. So,
like the Emily Wilson translation.
well, and see, I haven't read that. Everybody keeps telling me I need to read it, but for me, it's like I will one day read it. But yeah, with Shea's work, um, and the Odyssey in particular, Odysseus in America, he changes elements of the myth to fit his narrative about veterans. One of which is when Odysseus gets home and he has to leave with the oar to take it to a people who know nothing of the sea and who do not even put salt in their food.
Hmm.
He accuses Odysseus of quote unquote running off again. And it's basically saying like combat veterans are incapable of staying at home with their families, like they can't help but make a mess of their lives. Or he accuses the female figures in the Odyssey of being untrustworthy, and basically asserting that the whole problem of female figures in the Odyssey would be related to combat veterans and their unhealthy relationships with women, their porn addictions, their sex addictions, and their negative view of women in general. And to me, when I read the Odyssey, it's blatantly obvious that every one of these female figures is a critical part of him coming home. Like Odysseus changes because he meets them.
Yeah.
The myth itself talks about how the men were younger and better looking than they were before, and stronger than they were before, restored to the same health that they were before they left Troy. And so there's all these kinds of things where it's just blatantly obvious these female
Yeah.
figures help him.
The,
Or goddess Ino saving him from drowning by giving him her veil, or Athena's role, which is obviously in no way could you see that as bad. But yeah, so that was kind of a lot of my exposure. I knew nothing about Homer, and so I had to do a little research, and I mean a little, right? I know far less about Homer than probably most people who watch your podcast. But I read are you familiar with like the Oxford very short introduction books that are like usually written by an expert in the field? They're
okay.
little bitty pocket-sized books, but they're dense with information. So usually an expert on a particular topic will write a very short introduction to any topic, and it's like a peer-reviewed perspective on things you might want to know.
Hmm.
And so I read a handful of those on the Trojan War, Homer, the classics, all that. And whenever I read it, I was just mind blown because I had no idea how many of these things you're referencing, like the Trojan horse, or, different elements that we imagine as being part of the Odyssey or the Trojan War and the Iliad. Um, how many of those actually come from like these quote unquote lesser myths? I didn't even know those existed. I had no idea.
Yeah.
So I'm
It-
really a
It's
novice when it
it
comes to this stuff.
It's really fun talking with people who have not read the Iliad or the Odyssey before when they read the Iliad and the Odyssey, because they're always surprised not just by what's in there, but also by what's not in there. Like they'll
Totally.
read the Iliad and they'll be like, the Trojan horse isn't in here at all.
I
Nope.
know.
Achilles doesn't die in here. Nope. No,
Yeah.
he doesn't. Yeah, and there's so much other additional stuff worked in that they're like, huh. But um, I mean, first of all, there are many people who have read the Iliad and the Odyssey who are not familiar with it. I'll say, and conversely, I mean, you say, "Oh, well, like I'm not actually that familiar with Homer and stuff." Um, but if you can say that, but if you can read a book like Odysseus in America and recognize the twisting of the myth is missing the sort of, and maybe this will be an intro into talking about the substance of your book, the sort of dreamlike significance of what's actually going on in the story.
Right.
Um, Too literal of a take on these very strange episodes can actually miss the point. And I've done a whole thing on the Emily Wilson translation and where that goes astray. Um, but I think my least favorite take, and this is one that people will send me just to irritate me if they're in the mood for it, is the Achilles and Patroclus were gay take. And it's like, on the one hand, you can see why that's like a tempting take. They're like, oh, they really clearly like each other. They're like very into each other, and um, Achilles is willing to go back to war and sacrifice all these people for this person that he loves. Like, in our current society, we don't recognize that kind of male-male affection except in a homosexual context. So
Exactly.
maybe they were gay lovers. Oh, look, here's a line in Plato's Symposium that seems to imply that. Never mind Plato's very ambiguous mode of speech, which also has a Homeric tie-in. And so they make that assumption, and they entirely miss the thematic significance of it, which is told to us by the names of the characters themselves. Patroclus literally means paterkleos, the glory of the fathers. He is a stand-in, and as Greg Naj points out, a therapon, a body double for Achilles and a ritual substitute. And so his death is a foreshadowing of Achilles. Of course, he loves this man who is his therapon. Of course, he loves this man who is the symbolic embodiment of the glory that he loves and is pursuing, the the glory of the ancestors, Pater Kleos. So it's such a shallow reading to do that, and
Totally.
um and I will be honest, I to the audience here, I have not finished uh Odysseus in the Ore. I didn't make it very far. I'm from last night. I'm about 50 pages in. But I mean, even 50 pages in, you've already got such a um like thematically inline interpretation of these events with the sort of deeper themes going on in this story that you're talking about some very interesting stuff, and it seems to be from from your background as a Jungian depth psychologist. Nietzsche famously said Homer was the like seemed to capture the dreaming Greek. It is very dreamlike in its descriptions, um, both in the more sort of linear Iliad and in the perhaps slightly less linear Odyssey. Um, so can you tell us a little bit about your your well, let's talk about Jungian psychology a little bit, and the analysis of dreams going on in the Odyssey with you.
Yeah. So one thing I want to clarify. So I'm not a psychologist, so not a PhD
Oh,
level clinician, but
sorry.
just a
Yeah.
master's level. So I'm a licensed professional counselor. I got my degree from Pacifica Graduate Institute, which this school is entirely rooted in depth psychology. All the coursework is rooted in depth psychology, and I had an incredible education there, and I'm really lucky to have had that thanks to the United States Army and the benefits I was able to get because of my service. But uh, I very much came at this myth through what I think a lot of people would consider like the back door. So here's an amateur who knows nothing about the classics, nothing really about the Odyssey. And when I read Shay's book, something struck me as wrong, because not because I was familiar with the Odyssey, but because I was familiar with, a vast body of mythological material. And
Mm-hmm.
I had studied a lot of, I was in analysis by the time I had read the Odyssey for nearly 6 years. So I'd been going every single week to sit down with a Jungian analyst where I'm taking my dreams in there. And I'm also, as part of my education and just my own curiosity, I'm reading everything I can get my hands on. The Odyssey was just not something that spoke to me up to that point, until I guess it was 2019. But prior to that, I had read uh, a Navajo myth having to do with twin brothers, and part of their story involves coming back from war. I had read some Nordic mythology, which included a story about the theft of Thor's hammer.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I had read, the Epic of Gilgamesh. I had read, some of the medieval folk tales or myths, Parsifal and the Grail myth. I
Nice.
read the Cattle Raid of Cooley, which is a Celtic myth which features Cuchulainn. You know,
You're like reciting the reading. So I'm in a group called the Order of Fire, run by Jack Donovan, and I feel like you just recited the reading list of the last year. We did the Tan, we've done Gilgamesh, we've done through Homer, we worked through Plato's Republic. We did a month where we all studied different Amerindian myths. I was studying Spokane tribe stuff. Different people study different stuff. It's just fun listening to someone
yeah,
else through all these.
yeah. I mean, for me, I think it really, part of me wishes I would have been reading this stuff in or middle school, high school. Also, if it had been assigned, I don't know that I would have had the wisdom to read it. I wish I would have. I wish I would have had the discipline to digested this stuff earlier in life. But in reading a lot of that stuff, while I was in analysis, I would have these synchronistic experiences where I would notice the themes in my own dreams were very similar to the themes in some of these myths.
Hmm.
And there was some kind of some constant through lines or some constant themes that kept echoing. And so one of the things that Jung says, right? So we talk about Jungian psychology. Um, I guess maybe I should give a little background on Jung psychology for folks who aren't familiar. Would that be
Sure.
helpful?
Excellent. Yeah.
So early in Jung's career, the first thing that got him noticed is he was working at Bergholz, which was a psychiatric clinic, or what people might have referred to as an insane asylum back in those days. But it's for people who are severely mentally ill. And Jung had some really uncanny experiences while he was there that got him curious about the nature of the psyche. But one of the first things that got him noticed, and the reason that Freud noticed him, is because of his word association experiment. And he created a device that is, basically the predecessor to what we now call the lie detector. And Jung didn't create this to detect lies. He created it to detect complexes. Because Jung had
Which
noticed
makes
it.
sense.
Yes, I mean it's absolutely fascinating, and the fact that he had the insight to pick these subtle things up. But he would notice in working with folks that one thing could trigger them, and it's like they had lost themselves. That a certain family member could come visit, and all of a sudden they were impossible to relate with because they were so disturbed by someone's presence. So Jung created the word association experiment with a list of benign words, mother, puddle, bubble, whatever, random words. And he would read through the list of words while this person was connected to this device, and it's noticing what's happening with them physiologically, but
Mm.
he's also watching them, studying them, seeing how long it takes them to respond, seeing how they respond. And so when he would ask them or share a word, they were asked to reply with the first word that came to mind. And sometimes, an associated word would easily come back. So someone would say, he would say mother, and they would say father. But sometimes you might say to a person, mother, and they might get stunted and they couldn't think. And then all of a sudden they say some really inappropriate word back, something that doesn't fit.
Mm.
You know? And so for Jung, that break in consciousness suggested to him that the ego, that the conscious personality is not in charge of the flow of consciousness, that the ego doesn't get to direct the flow of consciousness. It doesn't get to choose the flow of consciousness. That what happens is that in certain moments, when a complex is triggered or when a complex gets touched on, right, that it interrupts the flow of consciousness. And all of a sudden, now the ego is along for the ride as this complex takes things in a new direction. And so we can think about a complex. There's different types of complexes, but one form of a complex is almost like a bruise on the psyche. And it's like a collection of images, of feeling toned images, is how Jung put it. And that if you take this image, that almost any image that we can conjure up has a slew of associations. That if I say pie, you might immediately think of apple pie, and not just any apple pie, but your apple pie from your favorite restaurant or the apple pie that grandma used to make. And that it's not just a pie. This is like a warm, comforting feeling that comes with it. That this image has all these associations tied with it that trigger a psychological experience that can be really positive or really negative. So there's countless examples throughout the literature and psychology where someone might be exposed to an image in a very subtle way, and it has an impact on their psychological experience. So someone might be walking down the street and here's a man smoking a pipe, and maybe they don't even consciously really recognize that they noticed this man smoking a pipe, or maybe they didn't really pick up on the fact that they were smelling the aroma. But let's say, for example, that this person was abused by their grandfather who smoked a pipe. Before they know it, they might be feeling really anxious and, tense, and not even sure why they're feeling anxious or tense. But their psyche has this association to the pipe or to the aroma of tobacco, which takes them back to a moment in their own history that is not a comfortable or safe one. And again, they don't even have to register it consciously to be affected by that. And so in the psychological literature, there's just you can find examples of this everywhere, that our consciousness can be interrupted by things that are outside of our conscious experience. So that's one side of this that I think is important as it relates to my book, and what I would call the warrior complex. And that for a lot of veterans, we go to war. Well, first of all, we're civilians who then go to basic training, where this warrior image, the archetypal warrior, is upheld as an ideal that we are invited to identify with, that we become warriors. It is our identity. And that mode of consciousness is supposed to direct the flow of energy in our life. We are to be warriors. But then you go to your unit where that is entrenched even further. And then you go to combat where you are asked to do grisly tasks, where identifying with that archetypal warrior is the only way that you can maintain the integrity of your psyche and get the job done, because it's a brutal job. It's a vicious job, and you have to allow yourself to be guided by that, or you're not going to make it, So for many of us, what happens is that this warrior complex becomes this, big gorilla inside of us. It's a 400-pound gorilla that is living inside of us. And it's this powerful force in relation to the ego. And in many cases, that force in our psyches might even hijack the system and become, we might identify with it. It might become our entire persona.
Mhm.
that we might imagine ourselves as warriors till the day we die, you know, and never, that thing might never relinquish its hold on us. And so, in the Odyssey, when I read the Odyssey, I'm coming at it from the perspective of Jungian psychology and the lessons I learned in my own analysis. And you look at what Odysseus is going through when he attacks the innocent people at Ismarus,
Mhm.
or when he goes on and picks a fight with Polyphemus. To me, I say, my gosh, this is a man who's possessed by the warrior complex. So I'm seeing it psychologically, right? So that's one element of this. The other element is the archetypal background. And there are, whenever we're working with dreams or myths, Jung emphasized that when we are in a particular psychological situation, archetypes appear as images that go along with the particular psychological context that we find ourselves in. So, for example, if you think about young boys who are transitioning into their adolescence or manhood, right?
Mhm.
That during those transitional phases, certain images are relatively predictable, and that they go through this transition, and the images of their youth, or the images that shape their psychology in youth, have to give way to these archetypal images that can lead them into masculinity. And so a good myth or an example of that is Iron John, where you see
Right.
this young boy who encounters this wild hairy figure, this big wild hairy figure, this image of the shadow, which would represent all of this unrealized masculine potential that is in this boy's psyche.
He has to unlock the cage.
Yes, exactly. That is inviting him to transform and to adopt those qualities and let it guide him into his own masculinity.
Yeah.
And so that would be an archetypal image that goes with the transition into manhood. And I see the Odyssey as being loaded with the archetypal images that are kind of inherent to the transition from warriorhood back into civilian life. And then that's mirrored by, countless myths around the world and other traditions. So
Do you mind if I read a quick quote from your book? It was one I actually underlined in on page 42.
sure,
You
please do.
say the warrior archetype or complex becomes anxiously defended against change until an equally strong or stronger impulse is able to displace it. In other words, military training, culture, and war itself set psychic energy in motion that transforms our personalities to prepare us for war, and our psychic energy will continue to express itself along this gradient until a time comes that a new experience or an accumulation of experiences causes a redirection of psychic energy that leads to a new adaptation. That was a very, very nice summary. And you go on to say that the three-step process for doing that is to make it conscious, to relativize it, and then to deactivate it. Um, about 2 weeks before I discovered your book and saw the image, um, I had been pressuring a friend of mine who's an Air Force PJ. I'm like, you need to write a book about your experience with the Odyssey, because he was the only one who I'd ever talked to who immediately picked up on the story of Odysseus and Polyphemus, the Cyclops. He's an interesting character because he is a he is a symbolic embodiment of the hero archetype itself. This larger than life, single-minded focus, that one eye, monocular focus that just destroys men, this man devouring monster that is symbolically captured in the megara mega, the so huge in your hugeness, as Greg Nosh translates the description of Achilles in death. Um, and what does Odysseus do? Well, he begins to shed his identity. He says, I am no man. He
Yep.
loses his name. And my friend, the PJ, was the one who said, no, the process of Odysseus coming home, that um that pursuit of nostos, which is etymologically associated with the noos, that mental connection that he has with other people, begins by shedding layers of his identity. First his name, then gradually his men, his ships, his crew, even his clothes.
Yeah,
and and even the stories about himself in war that he leaves behind kind of with the sirens. Like
it did
all of
me.
that is a gradual process of deconditioning in a sense, but set into a mythic form that's so perfectly captures what is going on, what has to happen, I should say. It doesn't happen every time, but what should be happening with veterans. And he was the one who only one who seemed to grasp this. And I'm like, you need to write this book. And then 2 weeks later, I see your book pop up on Instagram. I'm like, oh, it's been written. Excellent. So, um,
Well, to me, that's fascinating hearing that. And I, there's something about the nature of consciousness and the collective unconscious, and that certain things want to become conscious, it seems like on a collective level at a particular time. And it seems like this material, this archetypal material, wanted to become conscious in this moment of time. And I think that there's something really important on this about this on a collective level, not just in terms of like veterans mental health or but mental health in general,
mhm,
and then also more broadly in the society, because I think that, and I see this, like I was out in central Missouri, rural Missouri this past weekend at my in-laws place, and we went to the county fair. And, I see all kinds of people wearing grunt style t-shirts and, military apparel who I'm quite confident never served.
right.
But 2 decades of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, um, I think, and I think it's just really a lot of what was going on in our culture has invited this archetypal warrior energy into our society at large, not just for the people who served, but I think a lot of people want to identify with it.
Oh yeah.
And we could get really lost in this, and I could get off on a tangent really bad. And so I'm going to resist that or try to. But also I think that like modern society has been really disempowering to the average man. That the average boy doesn't have the experiences he needs to help him prepare for manhood in a way that gives him the confidence and the sense of connectedness to nature and his capabilities as a man, and that the experience of being man out in society doesn't usually give man the confidence in their skills or their natural abilities. That, well, here I am working at a bank, and I all I did is I went from high school to college, and now I'm working at the bank, and I've never spent a night in the woods, and I have never caught or killed my own food, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I think a lot of men are left with some sense of insecurity. And so when you see, you know, images like these bearded badass motherfuckers who've been in Iraq or Afghanistan, it's very easy to look at them and project some of your own stuff onto them and think, God, they're the image of, I'd like to have a little bit of that. I'm going to put on the grunt style t-shirt and show my support for it. I want to identify with it as a way of getting in touch, at least on the surface level, with that kind of power. And I think that there's something really important that happens in the Odyssey that I think needs to happen in our culture at large, which is that people like your friend that you mentioned, the PJ, and I've worked with hundreds of veterans in different therapeutic capacities, but a lot of the veterans I've worked with one-on-one, as a therapist doing one-on-one individual therapy with them. I mean, Ranger Regiment guys, a Delta operator, a Navy SEAL. And these are guys who have taken that masculine adventure to the ends of where a person can take it.
Right.
And until like your friend, which what you started saying about Polyphemus and how he saw it, I didn't experience like that, but I think that interpretation is brilliant. But I think that many of these men who've been in these situations have followed this masculine path to the very end, at which it can take them no further. And that ultimately, once you get to a certain point, you need the archetypal feminine to take you deeper into yourself so you can discover potentials that life, the masculine life, didn't afford to you. That to become more conscious, you need a different type of consciousness. And I see that in the Odyssey. And I think that that in our culture, we're at a stage now in which we kind of need to deactivate certain energies that have maybe in certain respects caused us to lose our balance. You know, that people have kind of gotten drunk on a fantasy, you know, that they haven't quite lived out to the degree that they need to on a more literal level, you know, or
Yeah.
symbolic level too. So anyway, that's just my 2 cents. I think there's a lot more here that applies to people other than just veterans.
Oh, for sure. I mean, the application to veterans seems to be an application that many modern psychotherapists are or have been particularly uh, lacking in the right framework to address. But in principle, and I mean, when I was reading your 3-step process of like basically how to deprogram yourself essentially from this complex, I'll be honest, the first thing that came to my mind was not combat. It was people who have been initiated into progressive leftist activism,
Mm.
because the same thing could be done, and could be done of any kind of initiation that has become pathological to one's relationships, to one's life. You would just use a different framework. You would just use a different set of experiences. You'd have a different points of reference in talking about that, but it could still be um made conscientious and relativized and eventually, hopefully, deactivated. You said you seem to be doing this because of blah, blah, blah. Do you are you aware of this? And I'm sure I have my own ones too, but, uh, well, I'll get a little bit personal without going into too many details. In marriage, in my own marriage, there's a tendency I think many men have to get defensive,
Sure.
in talking with their spouse about something. If they say something that you take as negative and you feel this need to defend yourself. um I was messing around with ideas, and I took on a different persona very consciously, um when talking to my wife about something that we had been arguing about for like a week or longer. Actually, I said, like, talk to me like I'm your gay best friend from high school. She doesn't have a gay best friend from high school, but it was a different persona. I put on a little bit of a different voice. I put on this, and it was shocking because here she was, she began to vent and complain to me about me. And just by putting on this voice and asking for it, I was able to hear that with zero defensiveness,
Hmm.
zero need to like, you know, um, and just getting into that different sort of mental frame consciously, making it conscious, can give you more tools, can give you more degrees of freedom, more power in actually controlling your environment and yourself, and
Yes.
escape these kinds of complexes.
What you just described sounds a lot like Gestalt therapy, by the way.
What's
And
that?
so Gestalt therapy, um, uh, I don't want to get lost on describing the whole thing because it's quite complex, but the whole idea behind Gestalt therapy is that um, there are all these segments of us that are just parts of a larger whole. And so you can see some similarities with Jungian psychology in that. But one of the techniques used in Gestalt therapy is what we call chair work. And so you'll have like an empty chair or maybe even two in the room, and you invite the client to go sit in the other chair and to basically have like a imaginal conversation with themselves from a different perspective. And so usually when you ask clients to do that, they're like, come on, what? Seriously, are we really going to do this? This is weird. And it is. And you can laugh about
Yeah.
it. But you would not believe the number of times I've witnessed people have a huge breakthrough when they go sit in the chair and they have this conversation with their father. And I remember doing this with a client once who's, in his late 40s, very successful businessman. And he was having these problems with his actual father. And so we did a little bit of chair work where he was having this imaginal conversation with his dad, replying to himself the way his dad would, replying to his father the way that he would. And I watched this, nearly 50 something year old, very powerful businessman. I watched him become a 12-year-old kid. I mean, it blew my mind because we had been meeting together for some time and I had been seeing him a certain way. But in that conversation where I watch him talking to an empty chair where he imagines his father is, all of a sudden he doesn't have the words. He's stumbling over himself. He's extremely insecure. He was afraid. He was really afraid of his fathers in ways that I could not comprehend until we did that. And I think that really highlights, the power of complexes and the way that we can lose ourselves when, a certain image arises that challenges us, and we're all prone to losing balance. We all do have our own complexes. We do have things that we can't see about ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of the things that keeps me really interested at, and just curious about the psyche. We all have our blind spots.
Well, I mean, you're talking about this from the psychological perspective, which I'm less familiar with, but it seems very much in line with some of the stuff that's interested me on the more philosophical side. There was a great philosopher who we lost earlier this year, tragically, named Daniel Dennett, who was specifically a philosopher in the theory of mind department. And one of the big problems in philosophy, maybe the biggest problem in philosophy, is known as the hard problem of consciousness, which is how can matter, even in principle, explain the origination and existence of subjective experience. And I don't think this answers the hard problem of consciousness, but Dennett's theory of mind sort of begins to lay a groundwork for it. He says consciousness is not a single entity. Consciousness is, as he called it, a bag of tricks. And your mind is not one thing, even though we sort of piece it together retroactively as if it is one contiguous entity. It's actually a lot of different things and different, to use Freudian language, drives, or Jungian language, complexes that are, in a sense, competing for the utilization of your body to do things. But you've got like a whole crowd of people crammed up here that do different things. And I think that maps onto what we are as human beings, because we're not contra the sort of heroic, single-minded drive to do one thing. We're not only one thing. We have many roles. We are, we are fathers and husbands, but also, part of us is still in that kind of hunting, dating mindset. We are professionals at work, and we are, soccer coaches for our kids, and we are, a friend to hang out with at the bar with the bros. We're like all of these different things, and each of those roles sort of inhibits the success of the other ones. Like the degree to which I am a really good professional at work can actually get in the way of being a good husband, and being a good husband could maybe get in the way of being a good dad, and vice versa. And so like navigating those things requires an ability to quickly move in and out, to take on and off different hats, sort of, so to speak. And I think this framework you're talking about really helps. I did have a couple questions. I know we don't have all the time in the world, but you mentioned like integrating the feminine and stuff. And this talk of the feminine is one of these things that gets talked about in a couple of different ways. And I think there's a lot of like self-help coaches who jump on and like, I'm a life coach now, without much formal training. And to them, integrating the feminine often seems to mean becoming more feminine. Is
Sure.
that what Jung meant, or is there like some deeper meaning going on there?
Yeah, I do not think that that's what Jung meant. Um, I mean, I think if you look at Jung himself and the way that he would have related to the anima, I mean, you can see it in his Red Book, which is his own book where he's exploring the realities of his relationship with the unconscious. Um, he wouldn't see it as becoming more feminine. And James Hillman, who I think is one of the most brilliant minds of probably, he's probably one of those brilliant people who will have touched this earth in, the last millennium, I believe. But his book Revisioning Psychology is incredibly important. His book Anima, Personified Notion, is incredibly important. And I touch on him a few times in my book. But Hillman really sought to correct a lot of the misunderstandings about people's perception of the anima. And Jung used the term anima referring to basically the soul itself and the personified image of the
Oh,
soul.
soul as opposed to spirit.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. So for Jung, the persona is the mask that we wear into the outer world, right? And that we have different personae, like that there are multiple personas we have that we take out into the world in different contexts. And that for Jung, the persona is in some ways, it helps mediate the relationship between what's in here and what's out there. So it's not an actual representation of the self in its totality. It's just a fragment of the self that we allow to be in the outer world so that we can have some relationship with it, depending on what's out there. But Jung believed that the greater whole of the personality of the self resides in the unconscious. And Jung noted that in myths and dreams, myths like the Odyssey, there are often female figures that are drawing certain figures deeper into themselves, into a journey, into an adventure where they encounter and discover things about themselves they couldn't have known otherwise. And we see this in dreams too. And Jung says, well, this female figure that's dragging these male figures into these experiences, he says that needs a particular name because it's distinct from shadow as a whole. And so he says, this is the anima. This is an image of the soul itself. And he called it the bridge to the unconscious. You know, for women, he saw it as being different. And we have to realize that Jung lived in a different time in which the average woman lived quite differently from the woman of today. Women were constrained in his time. They couldn't just go out and, get a job, wherever they wanted. They didn't have the same opportunities. And so even in education, and so just across the board, many women in, the late 1800s or early 1900s wouldn't have been living like the women of today. And so, but Jung in his day, his belief was is that men were lacking in soul and women were lacking in spirit and in logos and whereas men needed more of like the chthonic earthy realm of the feminine, that he saw women as typically lacking and experiencing like the ethereal realm of spirit and logos and ideas and being able to exercise that aspect of the self. So obviously this is all very controversial today, right? That there's tons of controversy around the terms anima and animus. Other brilliant people who I agree with have said that, well, woman today needs soul as much as a man does. Christine Downing advocated for the reality that women also have experiences of the anima and even need the anima to guide them into themselves. And so I'm not going to disagree with that at all. But in the work that Hillman did, Hillman kind of accused the Jungian community as a whole after Jung's death of reducing Jung's terms into basic ideas that Jung wouldn't have agreed with. And so one of the things that happened, unfortunately, as the Jungian community got out there and started writing their own books and forming their own ideas, is they wanted to make these things digestible. And
Oh
so
no.
it wasn't long. Yeah, yeah, which is like, right, we want people to be able to understand these things. We want them to be able to digest it. But we also don't want to simplify it to the point that we distort the ideas as they were intended to be understood. And so
which
it wasn't,
inevitably happens at scale.
yes, yeah, right. And it wasn't long before, the anima became equated with uh embracing our inner femininity, right? And that so people will think, well, the anima means nurturance and relatedness and compassion and empathy and being soft. And it's like, that can be true, but it is not the universal truth. And what Hillman really tried to snap down and say, this is what we have to understand, is that the anima is always in a compensatory relationship to the persona.
Mm.
What is missing from the persona will be found in the nature of the anima. That's how we can understand the anima, that um
Oh,
if, if the persona is this really hard, rigid, unfeeling asshole who thinks that everybody who cries is a snowflake, well, yeah,
then
the
their anima is going to be the
yeah,
opposite, essentially.
yeah, it's probably going to be inviting them into the realm of feeling and to embrace some of those quite kind of quintessential or stereotypical
But
qualities we might attribute to the anima.
but ironically, for many men for whom they feel alienated from their own masculinity, they're the baristas and stuff, their anima might be wearing a grunt style t-shirt.
Honestly, so this is the thing. And you know what the best way for us to get to the root of this is analysis.
Yeah.
And that something else Hillman said is that the point of working with dreams is to restore the diversity of the psyche, to save the soul from the rule of any single power.
That's a
Because
brilliant way of putting it.
yeah, because if we're just going through the world, if the ego with all of its biases is doing all the driving, then our best hope is that dreams and nightmares help us to see what we're missing. And dude, I have done, obviously I've done a lot of my own work in therapy and analysis. I was in analysis yesterday and I was sharing two dreams, back-to-back dreams that seemed very different, but were very related. And in the first dream, I would have included it in my book if it hadn't been published. But in the first dream, I was driving through a war-torn landscape. And in the dream, there were no bad guys. There was no battle to be fought, but there were, you know, potholes from where bullets had impacted walls, and there were guardrails and roads and blast holes in the streets. And basically, the message is that even though there was no battle left to be fought, even though there were no bad guys left threatening me, that the war had touched everything. I knew that it was an image of my own inner landscape that had been really badly wounded by war, and that those marks were permanent. That doesn't mean that I am permanently wounded, but that the war has left a mark on me. And the image itself, the dream itself, left me feeling really sad. I actually woke up crying from this dream. The very next dream, which seems totally separate, was related. And in the second dream, there was a ghost that I knew was female. I couldn't see her. And I was going to take a piss. I was trying to relieve myself, but I was afraid about the door being open. And so I had my foot behind me as I'm taking a piss, trying to keep the door propped open. And this ghost comes along and shuts the door. And there was a lot more to the dream, but as my analyst and I are processing this, it became very clear that the two dreams were related. The first evoking some sadness around the permanent marks of war left on my own inner world. And the second we understood as basically an image of the anima, that this is some unconscious force, some invisible force that is inviting me into a private realm where I can relieve myself. And that, even in the work of promoting my book and going back to these images of the war, like, you've seen my stuff on Instagram. I don't typically spend a lot of time looking at that stuff, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't evoke something in me. And I think the unconscious was trying to say, like, Adam, you need to take some time alone and let yourself feel this. Like, it's not easy to be reliving all this, right? Even after all the work I've done. And so, I think that's an example of one way the unconscious can kind of step in and hold up a mirror for us to see ourselves in from another perspective we wouldn't get from the perspective of ego consciousness. Because if you ask me how I was doing, I'd say, I'm doing great. I'm doing fine. Everything's wonderful. Everything's great. And the unconscious is saying, Adam, there's grief here that needs a private space so that you can, relieve yourself.
Right.
So that's just one example. And, again, I think that there's a lot of examples in the Odyssey or opportunities where you look at the imagery of the Odyssey and you look at, the influence of Calypso, for instance, that for 7 years, Odysseus is on her island, essentially facing his grief, and so that's kind of an
Well,
example of how
to
these.
the point of your dream too. Are you aware of the meaning of the name Calypso?
I actually am not, but please share it
It's
with me.
it's one who encloses or hides away from the world, like a ghost closing the door on you.
That gives me goosebumps. See, and it's unbelievable. I had no idea. Didn't know the meaning of the name. Absolutely no idea. But that kind of stuff to me, um, when we appreciate the archetypal dimension
Hmm.
and some of these historical things, I mean, if I'd written this book with someone like you, I probably would have had insights that were not possible for me
Well,
just
well,
because
but I
that
think
familiarity.
it's almost cooler the fact that you did it alone. For okay, I'm vaguely familiar with the Odyssey. I know these I know these like the story episodes, and here's how we would read them from from a depth psychologist perspective. And the fact that you have not been like a deep classicist and like studying the Greek and all this stuff means that when there is a crossover, you get some more potent triangulation. You get some more like, oh my gosh, this is useful. Because the question I was going to ask you, but I don't know if we have time, and I think you answered it anyways. Um, one of the most the Odyssey is full of cryptic little episodes.
Yeah.
It took me a while to sort of unravel Tiresias's prophecy. Um, but one of the other episodes that was most perplexing to me was the episode with Nausicaa, which is a very potent character, so potent that Hayao Miyazaki, the famous Japanese filmmaker, borrowed it for one of his
Yeah.
movies.
Yeah.
Um, and Nausicaa is a very interesting character. I have interpreted it for the last year and a half as a sort of vision of Odysseus's wife when she was younger, when he first met her, and
Wow.
it's a temptation to forget his wife in her current form and to accept
Wow.
her it only in his memory of her, because her parents offer her as a, hey, you could marry her if you want to Odysseus, and he turns her down. But it was a fascinating, but she's clearly helping him. She saved his life, and he promises that he will pray to her even when he gets home to Ithaca. And so she is both a temptation but a positive character at the same time. And her name always uh baffled me. Her name means burner of ships. Naus
Interesting.
Ika. So like,
That
what
gives
is
me
that about?
goosebumps.
What is that about? And just as I was going to ask you, what would you make of this name? And as you're explaining the concept of the anima, it's like, oh, Odysseus has spent the last 10 years, 20 years in ships being a pirate, basically. So how
He's not going
perfect is
back.
it that this female character, like the name had never made sense to me until now. So thank you for
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. There's no going back to the way he was. He's been permanently changed, not only by war, but he's also been permanently changed by the journey home. And he can't go back to being the
Hmm.
old Odysseus ever again. That's how I would take it. But and you see that even that when he's with the Phaeacians, I don't remember the man's name, but a man challenges him, and
Oh
kind of
yes.
mocks, like basically says like, "Oh, come on, you can't do it because you're a pussy." And Odysseus is like, "Dude, I would smoke you." He's like, "But I've been through too much shit to care." But the old Odysseus, to me, that kind of is a symbol of how much he's changed. Like the Odysseus of the Polyphemus days or the Isthmus days, that Odysseus would have taken on the challenge and whooped his ass, which I think that he ends up doing anyways after the guy challenges him again in some form. So he does prove himself, and he proves like, I haven't lost it. I can still be a gangster if I need to be,
Yeah.
you know.
As he does more brutally with the suitors when he arrives home.
Bingo. And that's a point I make, is that although we may fully immerse ourselves in the realm of the feminine, and although we may adopt many of her gifts and use those to help us adapt to the world of healing, which is the warrior's task after war, that doesn't mean that we become that image. It doesn't mean we identify with that image and let that be the thing that shapes us permanently.
Yeah.
But that Odysseus shows a remarkable ability to be more well adapted in both respects. He can be a gangster. He can be violent if he needs to be.
Yeah.
He can also be
Yes.
soft and related and hold himself through his suffering. And I
He's
think,
like water, like Bruce Lee, this
yeah,
this adaptive, this polytropon, this man of twists and turns, moving, shifting constantly this way and that way, as his
yeah,
opening epithet calls. Um, Adam, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. We actually went
likewise.
over
So
your
glad we
heart
were able to
outs
do
and
this.
having so much fun talking. Thanks so much for talking to this. For anyone who's listening to this, the book is Odysseus and the Oar. Is that available on Amazon, or is it only
It is.
through? Okay, it
Yeah.
is. And also, I pre-ordered it through the Dead Reckoning website, but you can get it on Amazon now, as well. So I encourage you all to go do that, check it out, especially, but not only if you're a veteran, because not only veterans um, suffer from pathological complexes. We all probably do at varying stages of our lives, even if this book has one complex in particular in focus, but it's probably useful to all of us. So,
Yeah.
Adam, thanks so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure. And to the audience listening, thanks so much for listening.
Chris, thank you so much. I appreciate you, man.
Absolutely.